For this week, chapter 2, we're going to talk about the Texas Constitution. And so, a unique part of our history as a state is that we've had more constitutions than every other state in the country. Reason being is because who controlled Texas has changed so many different times, and that's kind of unique to our history compared to other states. So, Texas has had more constitutions and has changed hands more than the other states in the country. Now, this chapter tends to be the one that if students are going to have trouble with a chapter, it's going to be this one. And it's not because the material is hard, it's just because this is the one chapter where you do have to know dates. You have to know the years that these constitutions were written because that's how they're identified, with the exception of the very first one. So make sure you associate those dates with the important things that changed in that constitution. Now, just a couple of things to get us started. We'll look at some definitions. So, what is a constitution? A constitution essentially is a document that lays out the principles and responsibilities of government. It lays out how government is going to be structured, how we elect officials, what the responsibilities of government is to the people, and how to make changes to the Constitution. All of that, all the governing principles of a country, or in our case, of a state, are laid out in this document. And so the founders of Texas went through the same process as the founders of the United States. And much of Texas's Constitution is based on the U.S. Constitution, but things that change throughout our history make our Constitution different and unique from the United States. Unlike some of the other states, Texas did put a Bill of Rights in their Constitution, and this is attributable to the fact that we were our own country at one point, the Republic of Texas, and so our Constitution includes a Bill of Rights just like the United States, and these are rights that cannot be taken away by the government. They are fundamentally guaranteed to us as citizens of the state of Texas. And we'll go through, some of them are the same as the United States Constitution, and I'll highlight some of the ones that are different. Social contract. This is an interesting concept in government, and it's something that, excuse me, sorry, it's something that, is kind of, been brought up more and more today because of our the things that are happening in our country and the responsibilities of government. But essentially, all of us, we never formally signed a contract, but as a citizen of Texas and the United States, we entered into a contract with our government. And essentially, what the social contract is we as citizens agree to be governed by a particular government, and we resign some of our freedoms, and we'll talk about this more as the semester goes on, but in exchange for surrendering some of those freedoms, government is supposed to give us security, protect our rights, and things like that. And so if you look at what's happening today in our country, especially with movements like Black Lives Matter, and what's happening with police and things like that, some citizens feel like government is not upholding their part of the bargain of keeping them safe, giving them justice, and things like that. And so when we see an imbalance in the social contract, that's when we can see a lot of social disruption. But here in the state of Texas, we can't just do whatever we want. Some freedoms we do give up because we are governed. So things like I can't get out on the highway and drive 100 miles an hour. But, not to mention that it's unsafe, but in exchange for resigning the freedom to just do whatever we want, we do get a more secure society. If you want to think of a society without a social contract, a good example would be like in the 1800s, the frontier, the Wild West. Really it was, who had, the strength and the firepower to be the strongest, that settled conflict. But once we have a government, laws and practices of government take the place of that idea. Popular sovereignty. This is the idea that democracy is built on, the idea that the ultimate power in our governmental system rests with the people. Now, some people, debate this idea. Does power truly still lie with the people? There's a good argument to be made both ways. We have a lot of dissatisfaction with government in our state. You can look at what's been happening with COVID, and people have been pushing back against the government, like in the lockdown, wearing masks and things like that. We never formally voted for any of these restrictions. They are things that were imposed on us by the state government. And so some people would say that, it's unconstitutional because we didn't consent to these things. And then some people would say, the government has to act in the best interest of all its citizens. But at the end of the day, we vote, and our vote is what puts those people in charge of us. And so at the end of the day, power does rest with the people because we make those decisions. Separation of powers, simple government concept that power of government is divided into different branches. Our state, just like the federal government, has three branches: the judicial, the legislative, and the executive. And then we have checks and balances where each one of those branches can restrain the power of the other two so that no one branch of government becomes too powerful, too corrupt, or, tries to impose like a dictatorship or things like that. Here in Texas, we have a plural executive. So in some states, the governor is very powerful, and what the governor says kind of leads the policy for the state. That's not the case in Texas. The governor is actually fairly weak in Texas. We have power spread out across our executive branch. We elect all of our officials in the executive branch. So the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, all these positions that make up the executive branch, we elect them all, and we spread out the power so that they oversee different areas of government. So that's the plural executive. Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause comes from the United States Constitution and essentially says that when a state makes a law, it is not superior to those of the federal government, but it is superior to those of counties and cities. So there's kind of a hierarchy of the law. The federal government has the final say-so in what is constitutional and what is not constitutional. So Texas can't make a law, for example, the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage. Texas now cannot make a law banning gay marriage because that law was established at the federal government level. But prior to that ruling by the Supreme Court, the states had a lot of power to make sure that counties and cities were not given marriage license to gay couples and things like that before there was a federal law. So there is a hierarchy to the constitutionality of the law in our country. Later in the semester, we'll talk about statutes and ordinances, and this is when we get into local government. So we'll talk about that later on. All right. So Texas, Texas was the land that makes up Texas was discovered and explored by the Spanish government. So the Spanish government was technically the first kind of overall ruler of Texas. But there was no constitution established for Spanish rule. Spain was an empire. They controlled all of their territories. And everything came from the Spanish crown. At that time, Spain was a monarchy. But Mexico, decides that they are not happy with Spanish rule, and kind of following the lead of what the Americans did with the British, they go to war and win their independence and claim all of the territory in Mexico and North America as Mexico. And so Mexico is the first country that we establish a constitution under. When Mexico wins its independence from Spain, they have this debate about what kind of government they want to establish. Do they want to be a monarchy like Spain, to be ruled by a king and queen? or they looked at what the United States did and questioned whether they wanted to be a republic where power lies with the people and they would elect their officials. And that is the route they decide to go. So Mexico establishes itself as the Republic of Mexico, or the Mexican Republic, and drafts their country's constitution in 1824. In 1827, a constitution is drafted for what's called Coahuila y Tejas, which are the conjoined provinces of Coahuila and Texas. So this is our first constitution. 1827, this constitution is typically referred to as Coahuila y Tejas. So it's the only one that's not identified by a year. It established some ideas that were borrowed from the United States Constitution, things like the separation of power into three branches of government, freedom of speech. One big difference, though, is that Mexico did declare a national religion. So Catholicism is the adopted official religion of the Mexican Republic, and they limited voting to those who could read and were employed. And Mexico was not a fan of slavery, and so in its initial establishment, they limit slavery, but they don't have complete control over some of the provinces because they're so far away. Texas actually wanted to be its own state. It didn't want to be conjoined with Coahuila. But Mexico refuses this request. The majority of people living in Texas at this time are white settlers that have come from the east coast of the United States. And they felt that if they made Texas its own state, that there would be so much influence from white settlers that it would diminish the authority of Mexican rule. So they conjoin it with another Mexican province so that Mexicans still outnumber whites when these two states are joined together. So this is what the Mexican Republic looks like. So you can see this is Coahuila y Tejas here, almost the complete shape of Texas, but a little different. So everything that is green at this point is formally part of the Mexican Republic, and then they would expand into California and Baja and other places as well. All right. So, after a while, the white settlers of Texas start to kind of push for more autonomy. Again, they continue to request to become their own state, to be able to draft their own constitution and things like that. And so Mexico is starting to get a little annoyed with the white settlers in Texas. So they start to put some things in place to remind them of who is in charge. And so most of the settlers that come into Texas are coming from the southern United States. And so they bring the culture of slavery with them to Texas. And Mexico, they had made rules about this and they didn't like the idea of slavery. So they passed what's known as the Law of April 6th of 1830, where they ordered Mexican soldiers to begin enforcing a strict no slavery policy in all of Mexico. And this was especially targeted at Texas, and they froze immigration into Texas from the United States. They felt that these white settlers were, now they outnumbered Mexican settlers in Texas. That they were becoming too demanding and that maybe some of the benefits were not worth the price they were paying of losing their authority. So they completely, they completely outlaw slavery. But the white settlers continue to bring slaves in. They try and find loopholes, like calling them indentured servants and saying they have contracts with them and this kind of thing. So this kind of begins a movement towards thinking about they're not quite to independence yet, but they start to draft some demands from the Mexican government. And so from October 1832 to April 1833, Texans, mostly white Texans, met in a convention to draw up a petition to the Mexican government. They demanded sovereignty and independence for a Texas state. So they were not saying they wanted to leave the Mexican Republic, but they wanted Texas to be its own sovereign state within that republic. They wanted the law of April 6th repealed. And they send this to the Mexican government, and they obviously reject it. Texans draft a Declaration of Independence in 1836. And there's a link to a video here it's a real good video that kind of walks you through the process of this conflict back and forth between Texas and the Mexican government. So watch that, and it'll give you kind of a timeline of how that played out. Now, the formal list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence for Mexico, they're listed here. Citizens are forced to adopt Catholicism. So most of the white settlers that were coming from the United States, they were Protestant Christians, and so they did not want to practice Catholicism. And again, they had that American mentality. America didn't want to be, part of the reason why people came to the United States was for religious freedom to practice whatever religion they wanted. And so they were bringing those ideas with them to Texas. Stephen F. Austin, and it'll talk about this in that video, Stephen F. Austin went to Mexico to try and negotiate with the government on behalf of Texas, and he was incarcerated and put in prison. So they wanted Stephen F. Austin returned to Texas. They had no right to a trial by jury. Mexico used more of a governmental system where governors and government officials would decide guilt or innocence. Judges, it would be left in their hands. There was no public education system established by the Mexican government. They wanted to dissolve the Congress of the conjoined provinces of Coahuila y Tejas because they wanted to be their own autonomous state, which that demand was rejected. Mexico started to engage in using desperados or outlaws, sending them into Texas to disrupt like farming and ranching, especially with white settlers who were ignoring the law and things like that. Mexico started to seize the arms of citizens in the state of Texas. And if you've never seen this flag before, this was kind of in response to that. There were 2 cannons that the Texans had, and Mexico demanded that they be surrendered. And so they created this flag and flew it during the war that basically was telling Mexico, if you want these arms, come and take them. And those 2 cannons are now on display at the grounds of the Capitol down in Austin. And then incitement of Native American attacks. The Mexican government was using Native Americans to attack white settlements along the borders of Texas. All right, so Texas, most of you learned the story in, Texas history and things like that. Texas does win the revolution with Mexico. And in 1836, they establish the Republic of Texas. And this is what the Republic looks like. So we have all of what we consider Texas today, plus a little bit of land going up into some of the other states. The 1836 Constitution was written shortly after the fall of the Alamo. If you're from Texas, you know the story of the Alamo. If you're not from Texas, you can look that up. Again, that's history, so I'm not going to go into that in this class. But they drafted this Constitution before they actually won the revolution, because in the instance that they won, they wanted to be prepared as soon as that happened to create their own form of government. So they draft a Declaration of Rights, which is kind of like a Bill of Rights. So they wanted the freedom of worship, so people would be free to practice, any form of religion they wanted. Freedom of speech, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, right to bear arms, right to bail, right to legal counsel and attorney, and a right to a speedy trial. So those were all things that were borrowed from the Bill of Rights from the United States. Some other things they added were provisions to prevent monopolies from forming in the Republic of Texas, and to protect free enterprise, which means to allow businesses to operate without many restrictions. And again, that's still, both of those are still kind of present in our political culture today, even though they're not. They're not established by the United States government. They're still kind of in our culture here in Texas. Um, they created a strict separation of powers, so they wanted the three branches of government to be separate, and they gave each branch different responsibilities. So the legislature had the power, the legislature had the most authority, and they had the power to levy taxes, establish tariffs with foreign countries, and pay debts of the republic. The executive branch, which was headed by president, because we were our own country, had the power to command the Texas military, make treaties with other countries, and appoint offices with consent from the Senate. So this is very similar to the responsibilities of the President of the United States. In 1836, in the 1836 Constitution, we set strict term limits, and we did not allow the president of Texas to run for re-election. So this is something that changed in our culture. And Texas kind of goes back and forth on rules for elected officials throughout our history, but in the beginning, we were very much against allowing people to stay in office for long periods of time. We wanted turnovers so that people did not get entrenched in politics and in government and become corrupt and things like that. But that has definitely changed today. Some differences from the U.S. Constitution. One, no clergy were allowed to hold office. So if you were a pastor or in a leadership position of a church, you were not allowed to run for office. But you did have to have a belief in a higher power to hold office. And this has actually never been completely removed from the Texas Constitution. But again, it's something that cannot be enforced today because of the rules of the United States Constitution. Also, individuals were not allowed to profit from government when they held office. And that, again, is something that has changed today. Texas was very anti-government corruption at the very beginning. And then some of this stuff starts to change because the culture of politics changes. The citizens of Texas initially wanted to join the United States, but because Texas was pro-slavery, Texas was not admitted to the United States because there was this argument over abolishing slavery and the southern states being pro-slavery. And so they didn't want to admit another slave state and give the South an advantage. So Texas in 1836 was not allowed to join the United States. So that's why they formed the republic. Slaves were not allowed to be emancipated within Texas's borders, and all free slaves in the state were ordered to leave by 1842, or they would be rounded up and sold back into slavery. Texas had a reputation for being one of the most brutal states to slaves. And so upon becoming the Republic of Texas, they made their intentions very clear about slavery. And so if you were a slave owner in the Republic of Texas, and let's say that you had a change of heart and you wanted to free your slaves, you were not allowed to do that. You could surrender your slaves to the state of Texas, and they would sell them or reallocate them to other slave owners in the state. But slave owners were not allowed to free their slaves within Texas's borders while they were the Republic of Texas. All right. Now, the Republic of Texas, it lasts from 1836 to 1845. There's kind of this romanticizing of the Republic of Texas. The Republic of Texas struggled for its entire existence. It had trouble, developing relationships with other countries. Its economy was not strong enough to support the entire republic. They had lots of debt they had incurred from the war with Mexico. And so, there's these people today who are like, Texas should secede. We were the republic and things were great back then. It really wasn't. By 1845, they are essentially begging the United States to become a state. And so in 1845, the president is James K. Polk, and he was one of these presidents that was really obsessed with manifest destiny and the idea of the United States expanding westward. So admitting Texas as a state just, made sense to him. On December 28th, 1845, Texas is annexed to the United States. I'm sorry. In December 1845, Texas is annexed as the 28th state to the United States. The former president, President Rusk of Texas, and members of the Congress and the cabinet, they have a convention to essentially change the Republic's constitution into a state constitution because every state is required to have one. So the Constitution didn't change much from 1836. There were a couple of debates that were had over things like who should be able to vote. So what they finally settled on was that all white and Latino males were given the right to vote regardless of whether they owned property. Now that sounds progressive for 1845, but the problem is that Latinos were not allowed to use their right to vote very freely. There was a lot of violence and intimidation and things like that carried out in the state to prevent Latinos from using that right to vote. So even though they formally give it to Latino males through the Constitution, there's a lot of, suppression of their vote, intimidation, violence, and things like that. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Native Americans, African Americans, and women were all excluded from voting in the 1845 Constitution. The power of the courts was expanded in 1845. The Texas Supreme Court was given its authority, much like it still has today. They could rehear cases from lower courts and overturn those decisions. We created the office of the Lieutenant Governor. He was basically kind of modeled after the Vice President, where the Lieutenant Governor would oversee the Senate, cast tie-breaking votes, and was kind of seen as a running mate to the governor. The role of Lieutenant Governor has changed quite a bit to the point that the Lieutenant Governor is now one of the most influential politicians in the state, but we'll talk about that as we go along. Governor in 1845 was given the authority to appoint judges and other executive officials. So we go back and forth on this. Should we let the governor appoint officials or should we elect them? So in 1845, the governor was given the power to appoint them, but the power was taken away 5 years later in 1850 because the governor abused it by appointing his friends with no political experience or people who donated to the campaign and things like that. So it wasn't a power that lasted very long. And then something that was a bit progressive was the Homestead Law. It protected Texas families from losing their property due to bankruptcy and financial issues. It gave landowners the ability to try and work things out with their creditors, for their homestead, what was considered their home. And then it extended property rights to married women. So during this time, if you were a woman and let's say that your husband passed away, in a lot of places in the United States, women had no property rights. So it would either go to the oldest son, or it would go to, if there was no son, it could go to a brother or an uncle or some relative you didn't even know. The Homestead Law made sure that if married women lost their husband or something happened like that, they could maintain ownership of their property. So it was a bit progressive in 1845. Now, the next Constitution is the one that is the most controversial. So we will talk about a couple of things here up front. So the next three constitutions, 1861, 1866, and 1869, were all rewritten because of the Civil War. The 1861 Constitution was written because the state of Texas secedes from the United States and joins the Confederacy for the Civil War. Now, there is a lot of bullshit that goes around about the Civil War. There are a lot of people who like to say that the Civil War was not fought over slavery. You'll hear things like the Civil War was about states' rights. Well, the states' right that they were fighting over the most was that of the southern states to own slaves. So, if anyone ever tells you that the Civil War was not fought because of slavery, you have my permission to slap them in the face. These are the top four listed reasons that Texas listed for seceding from the United States. One, failure of the government to protect borders. This had a lot to do with Native Americans. The western states on the frontier faced incursion from Native American tribes the most. And so Texas felt that the United States government and the Army were not doing enough to protect Texas citizens from those Native American incursions. Two, everyone pay attention to number two, abolition of slavery and slave rebellion. So this was stated by the state of Texas as its number two reason for leaving the United States, because the United States wanted to abolish slavery. So it's right there. All of these reasons were listed in the documents they submitted to secede from the United States. Number three, dislike of Abraham Lincoln and the Union. Why do you think they disliked Abraham Lincoln? Because he wanted to end slavery. And number four, Confederacy was more likely to expand westward. That was one of the goals of the Confederacy. They didn't feel that the United States was pushing westward fast enough. And so the Confederacy wanted to kind of enter into this contest with the United States government of trying to expand westward faster so that they could claim that territory for themselves. But these are the biggest reasons Texas submitted as justification for joining the Confederacy. Texas took a vote before this decision was made. And so this is how your vote played out. The counties in this kind of greenish gray color here voted to leave the United States. So you can see the vast majority of the state that was, formally, incorporated in the state of Texas voted to leave the United States. Counties that voted to remain in the Union are kind of in this orange color here. Down here around Austin, if you're familiar with the area around Austin, a lot of it was settled by, at this time, was being settled by immigrants from Europe, like from Germany and other places where slavery was not a thing for them. In those countries, so they didn't support slavery. It wasn't an issue for them. They didn't own slaves. And so a lot of that European mentality that they brought with them was why they voted against secession. And then we've got border counties here, and these counties they felt that the United States government could actually protect them better from Native American incursions, so they voted to stay. The counties in this kind of gold color, they had just been created and were not organized with local governments yet, so they did not really participate in the election. And then this district here had not been incorporated and things like that yet. So you can see of the counties that existed at the time, the vast majority voted to secede from the United States. So we had to change the Constitution again in 1861. The governor of Texas at the time was Sam Houston, again, one of the founding fathers. He opposed secession from the United States, and when Texas took this vote, he refused to sign the declaration that was approved by the majority of those counties. Because he would not sign it, he was removed from office. Um, North and West Texas pretty much wanted to stay in the U.S. due to the protection they did get from Native American tribes. The majority of counties that did vote to leave the United States, that's where most of the agriculture was happening. And so those places were very dependent on slave labor for their economics. And so that it motivated their decisions. We talked about the German settlers, talked about agriculture. And the Constitution of 1861 is essentially identical to 1845. They just had to go in and change everything that said United States to Confederate States. And then they added another clause about where slave owners were prohibited from freeing their slaves without permission from the state, and the state was not giving permission for that to happen. And just in case you're unfamiliar, this is the actual Confederate flag of the Confederacy. The one that you see all the time, the Confederate flag that we're having all of the debates about, that flag never flew in the state of Texas. That flag was, it was a battle flag for a particular regiment from the state of Virginia. It was flown, I believe, by General Robert E. Lee's regiment. It was specific at first to that regiment from Virginia. There was talk of wanting to replace this flag with that flag because many of the Confederates felt that this flag looked too close to the United States flag. But this is the actual flag of the Confederacy, not the one that you see all the time. All right, 1866. So the South loses the Civil War. People are still crying about this, and they should probably get over it. But the South loses the Civil War. So the United States ordered all of the former Confederate states to rewrite their constitutions upon losing the Civil War and being readmitted to the United States. The United States government was controlled by Republicans at this time, and Republicans during this time period are actually the more progressive party. They are the ones who want to abolish slavery. And so the parties will shift kind of their ideologies a bit as we get into the 1900s, but we'll talk about that later on. The military was sent into the South to oversee this process, which was known as Reconstruction. If you've studied U.S. history, you should at least be familiar with the term Reconstruction. And essentially, the Southern states were not happily complying just because they lost the Civil War. So the military had to oversee this process and make the Southern states comply with the terms that they had agreed to upon their surrender. The federal government threatened to intervene and essentially take over the Southern states if they refused to comply. Texas decides because of this, when they rewrite their constitution, they're going to re-centralize the power in the office of governor. So they would at least have someone from Texas having power and authority to advocate for what the state wanted. So the governor was once again allowed to appoint executive positions and judges. Pay was increased and the term was extended. The minimum demands that that Texas had to agree to was to repledge their allegiance to the United States, let go of any debt they felt they were owed for the Civil War, and invalidate any laws that were passed while they were part of the Confederacy. So this is the original kind of demands of Reconstruction. But again, the Southern states did not willingly comply with these requests. And so in a lot of places, there was pushback happening. There was not a lot of things changing, and so the Southern states were upset about the presence of Northerners in their states. This is what this picture depicts. You may have heard the term carpetbagger. And this was the tendency of people from the North to move down to the South to take advantage of this instability to make money, whether it was through buying land cheaply, setting up businesses, whatever it was. And so the South was not happy about the Northern presence in the states. And then, of course, this takes the form of the formation of a lot of different groups, the most well-known being the Ku Klux Klan. African Americans were given the right to purchase and sell property, to sue and be sued, and to enter into contracts. They were not given the right to vote, hold office, or be on a jury. There was a lot of pushback against this in the South, and so different organizations pop up. There's the White League, the Ku Klux Klan, and there's others. But essentially, there's this other set of rules for African Americans that exist in the South called the Black Codes. And so these are kind of the predecessor to Jim Crow. But the Black Codes essentially basically state that, African Americans are still not welcome in most places. If African Americans offended a white citizen, they could be beaten or killed. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized people through lynching, through burning people's homes down. And they didn't just terrorize African Americans, although that was the majority of who they terrorized. They also targeted anyone who supported the United States and the Union and would terrorize them as well. Watch this video because it kind of talks about how the Black Codes worked in Southern society at this time. Now, because the Southern states were not complying, we get another round of constitutions being changed. So the 1866 Constitution is Reconstruction 1. 1869 is Reconstruction 2. So because many of the states had the Black Codes and other discriminatory measures happening, Texas and many other states were ordered to rewrite their constitution again. And they ordered them to do certain things, go beyond what they had to do in 1866. So all male citizens of Texas, regardless of race, were allowed to elect delegates to send to a convention to draft this new constitution. The new constitution required all the southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, to essentially deny secession. Mentioning it in your governing documents was considered heresy to the United States. The 14th Amendment, so the 13th Amendment is the amendment that abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment basically creates a situation where the states must recognize the authority and the laws of the United States, because many of the states, the United States passed the 13th Amendment to end slavery, but the states tried to claim that it didn't apply to them because it was a federal law. Well, the 14th Amendment settles this issue by saying all laws of the United States apply in all states. So it establishes that precedent that the law of the United States is superior to the law of the states. It's the first constitution to establish free public schools. African Americans are granted the right to vote, but Texas still remains highly segregated, and the Republican Party takes control of Texas. And at this time, the Republican Party is not popular in Texas. Edmund E.J. Davis is elected governor. He is a Republican. And because of the previous constitution, he is given a lot of authority as governor. He is allowed to appoint officials, and he abuses this power and tries to appoint people all the way down to mayor, city councilman, district attorneys, things like that. And then Texas has this unrest going on because of crime and, groups like the Ku Klux Klan that are terrorizing citizens. And so Davis has the idea to create a militia to patrol the state to protect citizens from acts of aggression by the Ku Klux Klan and others like that. And one of the most unpopular things about this militia is that he allows both white and black citizens to be a part of this militia. So now you have newly freed slaves going around and telling white men what they can and can't do, and this just causes an even more violent backlash. And so he appoints officials that are incompetent, not qualified for their jobs. Texas gets close to bankruptcy because of corruption. He grants favors to the railroad, which the railroads were hated at this time because they tried to take people's land. So Davis gets voted out of office in 1873, and he loses the election by 50,000 votes, which is a huge margin in the 1800s. And so the Texans start to realize that maybe they didn't make the best decisions by giving the governor this much power. And so they call a convention to draft another constitution, which will be the final constitution and the one that is still in place today. 1876 is the final constitution. So, due to E.J. Davis abusing his power and the unpopularity of the Republicans, 1876, the convention is called to create a more fair and just form of the Constitution. And there are delegates from a lot of different groups, the largest being the Texas Grange, which is delegates that represented farmers in the state. There are Texas Rangers there, which are kind of our highest law enforcement agency in the state. And there were actually 15 African Americans that were part of this process as well. And the new Constitution gets approved in 1876 with a very substantial vote. And they go back to the beginning, the idea of popular sovereignty, that the idea is that the power should rest with the people. So all males are granted the right to vote, but they do put some things in place like the poll tax, which were specifically targeted at poor people and especially African Americans and poor Latinos to keep them from exercising their right to vote. Limited government, and this is still our culture today, that personal liberty is superior to government authority and government should be as involved in our lives as little as possible. So this is the structure of the Constitution. I don't expect you to memorize this or know all of this. It's just kind of the structure and how it's laid out. One of the things that's stated in the Constitution, no person or collection of persons being of one of these departments shall exercise any power properly attached to either of the others, except in the instances herein stated. So again, they go back to checks and balances, the three branches being very separate and checking the power of each other because the governor was too powerful and had become corrupt. So we get the structure and the culture that we have today from the 1876 Constitution. Texas Bill of Rights. They add a full and formal Bill of Rights to this Constitution. Much of it, again, is adopted from the United States. So freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right to a Republican form of government, which just means that we vote for our officials, they go represent us in government, right to bear arms, and protect the rights of people who are accused of a crime, due process. Texas allows victims to be awarded monetary compensation called restitution. So in a lot of states, if you're the victim of a crime, you'll have the criminal trial that decides the punishment for the person who committed the crime. So it will decide, will they go to jail? How long? Excuse me. How long will their sentence be? All that kind of stuff. And then you have to have a civil trial where you can sue them for monetary compensation. Well, in Texas, we kind of cut out the middleman a bit. And if you're a victim of a crime, the judge can just award you monetary compensation as part of the criminal trial. So this happens quite a bit in our state. Unrestricted access to Texas beaches, which, we don't have the greatest beaches in Texas, probably South Padre being the best. Allows for denial of bail in cases of family violence. This is because if I have any criminal justice majors, you may know this. In cases of family violence where there's violence between spouses and things like that, Typically, once someone is arrested, as soon as they get out of jail, there's a high likelihood that they will go find that person and commit a greater act of violence against them. So in Texas, we can actually deny bail in those situations to prevent that from happening, which is kind of unique to our state. Right to an adequate and funded public school system. Now, note that it says adequate and funded. It does not define what those things mean. And we'll talk about, the school system in another chapter. Amendments, any change to government authority in the Constitution have to be done through amendments. Texas actually has more amendments than pretty much any other state. We have 498. The reason being is that the amendments will get approved by the legislature, but they go on the ballot to be voted on by us, the voters. And a lot of us don't read them and pay attention. We just check a box. And so the statistic is that if an amendment goes on the ballot in Texas, it's got a 74% chance of passing. So people just aren't paying attention to what they're voting for. Texans tend to favor amendments that reduce taxes and spending, but rarely approve amendments that increase the pay, size, or term limits of government officials. And that's pretty keeping in line with our political culture.